Welcome to Risk Matters, the insurance podcast brought to you by DWF and your global guide to the latest trends and issues in the insurance and reinsurance industry. Join us as we explore topical issues, emerging technologies, and the innovative strategies that are shaping the global future of insurance.
Welcome to Risk Matters, the insurance podcast from DWF. Today we'll be talking about renewable energy insurance. I am Franco, a partner in the DWF Global Risk team based in London. I'm joined here with Gary Walkling, a fellow partner in the DWF Global Risk team. Hello, Gary.
Hi, Franco.
And we're joined today with a very special guest, Adam Reed, who is the global leader for offshore renewables and upstream energy at Allianz Commercial. Welcome, Adam.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
I'd like to start with an opening quote. I just want to thank you all for all you're willing to do, and particularly the private companies who are stepping up. And it's big time. We're stepping up. We're talking billions of dollars. We're not just talking a little bit of money. We're talking billions. And I think we're going to get a lot done. And I can't tell you the last time I've been this excited about something we're about to do, because I think we can literally begin to change the nature of how we generate energy. And the industry is stepping up. Now that, of course, was President Biden on the 23rd of June 2022 at a meeting of the Federal State Offshore Wind Implementation Partnership. So, Adam, with that in mind, is President Biden right to be so excited about the future of offshore wind?
Yeah, I think everybody should be excited about offshore wind. It's really one of the most transformational things around supply of energy for, the world, right? I mean, a time when everybody's focused on energy security and having their own source of power, it's something that goes a long way towards that, right? So,
yeah. And do you think that particularly in the States with their very ambitious targets, is that something that you are conscious of in your role?
Conscious of it, yeah. I mean, the US, it's a bit challenging as far as offshore renewables goes. Certainly, we've seen shortages in terms of, vessels. You've got Jones Act complications, and also exposure to cat risk, which perhaps we haven't had in Europe.
Yeah.
But, there's also a lot of opportunity there. So it's definitely an area that we're keen on and looking at closely. So.
Yeah.
Adam, so outside of the US, where are some of the other bigger areas for geographical growth?
As far as offshore wind goes, Europe has a huge amount of installed capacity, right? I mean, that was the starting point for a lot of the offshore wind farm developments. They've been around for quite a while now. I think more recently, we've seen a lot of growth in Asia, particularly Taiwan, and then Japan, Korea coming up. They're maybe a bit further back. And then, China has got huge targets for offshore wind and actually has been installing some of the largest turbines that, we've seen anywhere in the world. So those areas definitely. But again, similarly to the US, you've got that cat element of exposure as well, which, we don't have that so much in Europe. So.
Mm-hmm. Stepping back from maybe some of the bigger picture, on a more personal bit, can you tell us a bit about your route into the industry and how you became a renewable energy underwriter?
Yeah, for sure. So, I started out in property, actually, probably quite a long time ago now. Moved into upstream about 15 years ago, something like that. And at that time, offshore renewables wasn't really a thing. Learned a lot about the kind of marine type exposures that you have in upstream oil and gas. And then, obviously seeing the synergies between that kind of risk and the risk that you see in offshore wind. Mm-hmm. When the opportunity came up to get involved in that, then it was a natural fit. And I think, we're seeing that more broadly across the insurance market as well. There's a lot of crossover from individuals and also just general principles. So,
I think one of the themes that we wanted to draw out during this podcast, and hopefully we'll draw out in the course of the discussion, is whether we are all, as an industry, learning the lessons that have already been learnt from things like oil and gas, or the marine market, or the property market, because it seems to us from the outside as service providers to the industry that there's a lot of knowledge base, both within the renewables market industry, but also within the insurance market as well. And just an open question as to whether we could be doing more to establish and to overlap and to share knowledge for lessons, as I say, that have been learnt before, perhaps?
People often talk about kind of, synergies in terms of that element, right? Exposure and risk. I think it's a very different proposition insuring a wind farm compared to an oil and gas asset.
Yeah.
At the moment, most of the risk in offshore wind is construction.
Yeah.
And you're essentially repeating the same process 100 times, say, on average, right? Whereas with upstream oil and gas, it's typically one asset or a couple of assets. So, from a risk perspective, yes, you've got the marine element, and you've got marine warranty surveyors and whatever else to help you with that. But also, the process and the exposure is quite different. It's a lot of attritional, and you don't have so much that kind of peaky exposure like you have with oil and gas. But there are certainly things that you can take, right? So like I said, the marine warranty part, something that's really, really important to get that right. I think offshore wind, in maybe infancy, if you want to call it that, there probably wasn't enough focus on that side of things, that kind of third party review and attendance and agreement to the kind of the processes that they were going to go through. So that definitely is vital. I think just looking more kind of from a technological perspective, upstream oil and gas from a, construction wise, it's benefited a lot from codes and standardization of the assets. And offshore wind, it's probably the opposite end of the scale really a lot of the time.
Is that even for fixed foundation offshore wind?
Yes, I would say so. It's incredibly common from a kind of project perspective. When you get something in, a lot of the times the turbines that are going to be used haven't passed type cert yet.
Okay.
So in other words, they're not a proven design effectively is what that means. So you've still got another 18 months where you're going from the test turbines installed to, okay, you can actually, you can use it if it's not type certified, right, in theory, but you wouldn't want to from a insurance perspective, right? So, there are a lot of elements like that where, it's kind of almost pre-industrialized, right? Because of this kind of turbine arms race, if you want to call it that, in terms of, it's got to be bigger and maybe not necessarily better in all cases, but definitely bigger. And, that does create a huge amount of technological risk. From an insurance perspective, maybe insurers aren't necessarily picking that up as far as the turbine's concerned, because a lot of the times it's covered under warranty, under the turbine supply agreement. But if you look at some of the kind of published financials of some of those suppliers, you see, large negatives against their earnings from exactly that, having to meet those requirements for the warranties they've given for turbines that, haven't necessarily worked as intended. So, I think there are some schools of thought that say maybe let the technology bed in a bit more, and that maybe in itself will ensure the kind of long-term profitability of some of these suppliers. Nobody necessarily wants to be the first one to do that because the other company will still be making a bigger one, right? So it's a difficult one, in a competitive environment, but you can certainly see the benefits of it when you see how some of these companies have struggled financially recently.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Now, Adam, how do you go about underwriting a risk or rating a risk like that where you don't have the same historical data that you perhaps do in traditional oil and gas?
Yeah, I don't want to give away too many trade secrets, right? But for us, we always focus very heavily on the risk engineering side of things. So, we have actually a large number of engineers across different technologies. So whether it's electrical or turbines or master mariners. So, we try to take as much from the things that we've done as possible, and then also lean on that expertise to kind of assess the almost unknown elements of the risk, right, to try and get to what we hope is an accurate rate. Yeah.
Now, Adam, you mentioned earlier on about marine warranty surveyors, and obviously they must be a critical part of it, but we've seen them for many years in the oil and gas industry. So I thought maybe it'd be a bit of worth spending a little bit of time just exploring that and whether they're utilised correctly in renewables. So Gary, in terms of historically what has been their role on any given, say, oil and gas projects?
Yeah, so I think, as Adam said, an MWS will give you independent, expert, third-party approval of things in advance, but then also they'll attend certain high-risk, high-value activities and then issue certificates of acceptance when those are done. My own view is that, I mean, you'll barely see an oil and gas project without some MWS involvement, but my own view is that they could certainly be used more in oil and gas, and I don't know if that tallies with your experience in renewables, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, from my perspective, I guess going back a bit to my kind of background, you know, I've over the years, you know, been involved in huge numbers of offshore oil and gas construction projects, right? So, you know, that third party oversight element, you know, it is incredibly important. It's vital, really. It's probably one of the most important clauses to get right, I think, whether it's exactly what activities or, you know, the amount of attendance or, you know, what you're review approving COAing, right, like you say. In renewables, it hadn't maybe had as much of a profile. And I think, you know, in terms of also how it was expressed, it was maybe not as precise as it should have been. Implications of breach weren't always clear or were clear that there weren't as many as there should be.
Not an uncommon problem, to be fair.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the Joint Natural Resources Committee actually has done a significant amount on that, issuing the standardised scope of work, which I think we're on to the second iteration of now, which has borrowed a lot from the one that was established, you know, for the oil and gas projects, but also kind of adapting it, obviously, for renewables and for the different exposures there. Just kind of from maybe a client or the kind of process perspective, what we do see definitely in renewables is, firstly, the MWS being involved a lot later in the process. So almost, I think it would benefit clients to, you know, for them to have the MWS to have more time to kind of do all the document reviews and all of that kind of thing. We've heard stories of, you know, people being sent stuff and told, oh, by the way, loadout is, you know, happening in 5 minutes
yesterday
ago or something, which is, you know, it's not helpful, right? And, you know, ultimately the whole point of it is safe delivery of the project.
Yeah, of course.
You know, so the more you can do to get the best chance of that, the better. And then also the other thing is, you know, there seems to be almost like a focus on the warranty fee as a kind of a procurement item. So, you know, it's quite price driven is the impression that I've got, which, you know, insurers are the ones that effectively pay, right, or contribute. So the insured will pay it, and then insurers will contribute an amount from the premium to, you know, for that to get done. So yeah, a lot of the times that amount that is contributed from the premium is more than enough for warranty surveyors to get a decent
worthwhile
price, right? So I think from our perspective, you know, we feel like it should be much more about who's the best person for the job rather than who can maybe deliver it for maybe the most competitive price, right? It should be more about quality and ability to meet the scope with people that have the right qualifications.
Adam, when did you first notice a step change in the focus on renewables? And going back to Franco's earlier quote from President Biden, have politicians always been as excited about this technology?
I wouldn't say so necessarily, no. I think it varies country to country, really. You know, I think the offshore wind industry does really need a huge amount of coordination at government level, whether it's, you know, kind of licensing or routes for grid or even grid investment, cross-border interconnection between power grids as well, because you can't just pick up the electricity and carry it somewhere else like you can with oil and gas, right? Yeah, or battery storage, all of those kinds of things, right? So it covers a lot of topics that need political engagement. I think in terms of kind of industry growth, probably maybe the last 5 years, I think we've seen it kind of really take off. And I think that's kind of coincided with maybe a period of political instability as well in other regions, which obviously has fueled that desire for people to kind of have self-sufficiency from renewables, but also the significant growth that we've seen of kind of climate awareness. It's really come into focus since the Paris Agreement, and people have, particularly in the last maybe 2-3 years, started. It's a lot more in the kind of political consciousness of
and the public consciousness as well, I think. As well, which obviously leads on to that political aspect as well. What was interesting when we were putting the statistics together for this podcast was almost every developed economy has either 2025 or 2030 targets for renewable development. And it's just interesting that seems to be a virtually universal trend and a push into the renewable industry. Do you think that there are any jurisdictions where, yes, there are supply chain problems and local manufacturing issues, but are there any jurisdictions where there is a more holistic approach, where there is those targets are being met with really good work on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that a lot of countries have 2030 targets and they don't have anything installed yet. I think it's probably important to note that. But yeah, I mean, places that have good local supply, I mean, I think it's a big issue for the industry. Really, outside of Europe, the only other place that you could point to probably is China. The US for all of the investment, the IRA, and all of that kind of stuff. I think, probably not enough, or not as much as probably they should have done of that has been used to bulk up the supply chain, right?
That is that's the US Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, which provides kind of funding through various means, tax and things like that, to support green energy growth, amongst other things. So if you look at the US and what's resulted from that, there's one cable factory, I think, in Charleston. There is one Jones Act compliant vessel which has been delayed a few times, if you see the stories of that in the press. And so for a country that has got a lot of a significant target, right, it's maybe lagged a bit on addressing some of those supply chain things, whereas you look at China, there are a decent amount of vessels. There's cable factories, there's turbine supply, and there's also a significant pace of installation. Yes, certainly other countries have maybe lagged a bit behind in terms of kind of implementing those key things that you need to make offshore wind happen.
And sticking with the US, Adam, aside from some of those issues you mentioned there, are there any other particular challenges with offshore wind there?
In the US, I think they produce certainly a challenge in themselves in that it means that your cost per megawatt hour of electricity is drastically higher than it is in Europe, just because the fixed costs of taking all of the components over, all of the vessels over, you've got to do ship-to-ship transfers a lot of the time.
Is that a Jones Act issue?
The vessels, yes, is a Jones Act issue until that one comes out of the yard. But then also, you can't do all of the East Coast US projects with one
vessel.
Well, no, one cable factory. I was going to say.
Or one vessel.
Or one vessel. Either, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it does make the fixed costs a lot higher, which that potentially harms the argument at the ballot box. It's how much. I think some of the ones reported in the press are kind of around $135, $140, which, if you compare that to UK, I mean, what's the most recent one is what, £65 or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean it's drastically more expensive in the US. Other things, yeah, I mean, like I said at the start, that cat element. At the moment, there is only one commercial-ish scale wind farm. I think it's 5 turbines, and then I think there's another one which pretty much up and running now as well. But looking at that long-term understanding of how these turbines respond to those kinds of wind speeds, ones that have been installed so far have been fine, thankfully. But again, you don't get a stochastic event set from 5 years of being installed or whatever it is. So, it's really trying to understand the long-term impact of higher category storms and higher wind speeds on the longevity of the turbines.
Sure. We've mentioned the Jones Act a couple of times, so it's probably, Franco, I don't know if you want to give some background to what that is for people who may not know.
Obviously, it'll be very well known to you, Adam, but what's interesting is the vessel you mentioned, the one Jones Act compliant vessel that is under construction. We've seen constant pushbacks as to when that will be delivered. It's looking like 2025 is the most recent published date, so we'll see if that maintained. But in any event, the Jones Act, just to give a little bit of flavour to anybody who's listening who's not fully aware of that, so it's a piece of US legislation, or in fact a number of pieces of legislation that are collectively known as the Jones Act, and effectively it limits trade between 2 fixed US points to US Jones Act compliant vessels. Broadly, that means that the vessel has to be US built, which I think is probably the most critical category, but also US crewed, US flagged, and then US owned. And the issue there is you can't just buy a vessel now and say, we're going to make this vessel Jones Act compliant, because you'll fall foul of the Jones Act requirement for the vessel to be built in the US. And the difficulty, I think, is that there's decisions from the US Customs and Border Protection Agency which establish that every fixed turbine, once installed, is a fixed US point, which means that when you are transporting, either per the Jones Act, merchandise or passengers from one US fixed point, so that could be a port somewhere in the US, to a wind turbine in US waters, that vessel has to be Jones Act compliant. And of course, that's where there is just not the tonnage to be able to satisfy that at the moment. So there is a workaround, and that is, I think, as you mentioned earlier, Adam, you either transport merchandise from other locations, so you might go from Canada to your turbines, or you might use feeder barges. And certainly from an insurance perspective, when you're making those kind of equivalent of ship-to-ship type transfers, that adds another risk layer into the mix. And of course, creates, to put it no higher than that, inefficiencies in the process, which must be reflected in the price.
Yeah, I think it's also reflected in how slowly some of these things are going in. Well, right, it's getting used to that. You've got to probably do it, 3-4 times maybe for each turbine, with the foundation tower, the cell, right? So yeah, it does make the whole development time much more significant, which renewables projects, they tend to get probably delayed more than oil and gas ones. I think it's probably fair to say. So just adding that additional layer of complexity, it certainly it makes it more complex, for sure.
And to put it into context, the US are looking at 30 gigawatts installed by 2030, and a project like, I think, Hornsea 2 is 1.65 gigawatts, and that's about 165 turbines. So just thinking about that sheer scale of the upscale that's required is significant.
Plenty to do before 2030 then to hit some of those targets.
Yeah.
Does some of those challenges that we've been talking about mean that insurers' appetite for those kind of US risk are diminishing, or is there still a strong appetite for them?
I wouldn't say it's diminishing. No, I think it's more been about whether or not some of those projects would come to fruition. I think it's almost the other way around. Obviously, we've seen certainly one fairly high-profile one which ended up not happening or getting withdrawn. And certainly there have been a couple of others that have been at risk, high profile ones as well, which have, had to renegotiate their power purchase agreement, their PPAs, to be able to get enough income, right, to make the projects viable. But yeah, I mean, from an insurer perspective, I think people are definitely monitoring the cat exposure, but I think, from a general risk point of view, I think people are happy and keen to write them from what I've seen. So.
We've discussed some of the issues about vessel availability in the US, but broadly speaking, elsewhere, vessels are available and there's no similar pipeline issues. I ask a very leading question.
Yeah, I mean, vessel availability definitely is an issue in most places.
Yep.
We've seen not just with the delays to the Jones Act compliant one,
Yep.
but also, we've had issues with other vessels that were being newly built. They've had to be substituted out because, it would have put the whole project back by a significant amount of time. If you're in Asia, other than China, certainly the remoteness of some of those places, that can add, a lot of time and also potentially a lot of cost for demobilization if you need to get a specialist vessel down there to do anything really.
Well, one of the reasons I knew that was a problem because I'd read your report, or we'd both read your report, or the Allianz report, A Turning Point for Offshore Wind. Are there any key other issues that came out of that report that surprised you, perhaps?
That surprised me, I wouldn't say too many. I think from my perspective, you would maybe hope not. Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of the things we touched on in that were around, there's a lot of growth planned in a lot of different regions, but certainly there are significant challenges, whether it's design, supply, vessels, all of those key things. But, I guess recognizing the kind of the scale of, firstly, the opportunity, but also, some of the issues that have to be addressed to make that a reality.
So, Adam, another key point that was in the Allianz report was about cable claims, and in particular export cable claims being the biggest driver, certainly by value. Are you seeing the cable claims generally, or the cable market maturing in such a way that those claims maybe should lessen as time goes by?
I mean, I think it depends on what's caused the claim, right? I think, talking about marine warranty scope, having that oversight over the installation process will certainly help. I think, you'd be pushing it to say that it will disappear completely, right?
Do you think the technology itself is improving to the design standards?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cables that are in use now, that element of the design side, or those kinds of faults seem to be, a bit less frequent. I think it's probably fair to say.
Yeah.
But then, with the bigger turbines or, with the bigger wind farms, is that technology then going to have to move on, as far as kind of cable kilovolt capacity goes? And then also, the other thing is talking about, going back to that supply chain question again, new factories, you're going to have really tight control over the manufacturing, right? Because, not necessarily people, but, the equipment or, the process, even the climate where some of these places are located, all of that stuff's going to impact the performance of the cable, longer term. So I think it's, keeping that as tightly controlled as possible.
Do you think that risk is exacerbated as these projects go deeper and further out?
Well, certainly it will make field jointing a lot more challenging, yes, because, obviously, you're going to have to get the cable up. That's going to put probably a reasonable amount of tension on it anyway. I mean, even lays in deeper water, right? You're going to have to be very careful about, the bend radius of the cable. So there is a decent still amount of nearshore activity that we've got to go, but certainly into the future, if you're looking at West Coast US maybe, or somewhere where you've got a much more significant drop off of shelf, then yeah, for sure.
The cable's going further out. Sounds like you're talking about floating offshore wind.
Yes, and actually on floating offshore wind, obviously, as well as the Allianz report, Franco and I have also read Franco was involved, I think, in the EMEA report that recently came out, and that identified some novel risks in relating to floating offshore wind and some crossover with more traditional marine risks. I think you touched earlier on in the podcast about the lack of standardisation in floating offshore wind in particular. What do you think the offshore wind farms of the future will look like?
What will they look like? I think, floating is something that's going to be needed to meet some of those targets that we've been talking about, right? You do get wind speed, which is going to kind of give you a better yield the further away from the land you go.
Yeah.
And, there just probably isn't enough space on the continental shelves of the continents to be able to meet the demand just purely with fixed bottom. So, I think, floating definitely is going to be important, but there are a few elements that need to be looked at, I think, as far as that technology goes.
What was interesting, or I would say the most interesting feature for me looking at the floating offshore wind for the purposes of researching the EMEA paper, was that existing turbine designs will be used for those floating projects. Mm-hmm. And so the new bit would be what's known as the floater. And of course, there's no standardized design at the moment for any particular floater. They all seem to be very project specific. But you're taking an existing turbine design, placing it on a new, novel designed floating concept. And what you're left is this kind of hybrid turbine that is half new floater and half new existing turbine. And I just wonder what that does to, within the existing turbines, what it does to things like the gearboxes, if indeed the turbines have gearboxes, some are direct drive, or the bearings, or the housings and things like that. So that will be very interesting to see, as even for mature turbine technology, to see how that copes with being in a floating offshore environment.
Even before you get onto that, though, right? I think one of the big challenges with floating is being able to, or not being able to at the moment, do much in the way of in situ, particularly main component change outs.
So everything's got to be towed.
Yeah, exactly. That's what that means.
Yeah.
Which, and firstly, it's the cost to, if you have something that affects more than one turbine, right? That's going to be a big
operation. Which you've seen before in offshore wind.
Well, I mean, you see it with fix, right? You see it, often, not as often as you used to, perhaps, but having to uncouple the moorings, the cable, tow the individual foundation back in, depending on the design of the foundation, what's the port availability like, depending on the draft or what else is in there. So, I think, what one of the biggest things that will help is some kind of in situ, whether it's being able to lift the foundation out or something that attaches to the tower that can be used, so that you don't have two floating, the vessel and the turbine moving around, which obviously could create a bit of a disaster. But so some sort of in situ. Very much looking forward to
interesting
the day that happens.
Adam, one of the issues that was identified in the EMEA paper was what happens if a turbine becomes detached and floats off. Is that something that keeps you up at night, or not something you're particularly worried about?
It doesn't yet. Whether or not it will, I mean, it's something potentially foreseeable. I think the implication of it is resultant damage, right? Obviously. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But then also, if you're looking at anything with, because, shared anchoring systems are something that are being spoken about, at least if not done yet. So, if you lose one of those, you're potentially losing multiple turbines in one go, and then depending on which way the wind and waves are at the time, you could be losing quite a few more potentially. So yeah, I mean it's something that certainly we're looking at. I think also it does depend a bit on the foundation design as well, right? If you've got like a TLP type foundation, you know, you're going to have, it's something like 10 times the upwards force on the anchor. So, you know, that potentially is maybe a bit more at risk of something like that, just because of the ground conditions you need. Yeah, I think probably traditionally more foundations are going to be more prevalent though. So yeah, I think it's having a lot of focus on that. And I think, you know, we learned the hard way from incidents in the oil and gas world about the importance of having the right mooring and making sure your chain is inspected regularly, you know, how that mooring is set up and having a good kind of risk management in place for that.
It seems
will
like
help, yeah.
But that's another interesting, I think, overlap between the knowledge that's already there in the oil and gas industry, certainly, and certainly amongst insurers who insure traditional oil and gas projects. That knowledge exists about mooring lines. This is not really brand new cutting edge technology. What's different is it's being used to moor a wind turbine as opposed to an FPSO. And I suppose the risk there is you've only got perhaps 3 mooring lines as opposed to countless mooring lines on an FPSO. Creates a slightly different risk profile from that perspective.
Yeah, but also, I mean, you know, stabilizing a semi or effectively a vessel, right, in an FPSO relative to I don't know how much, you know, quite a few times smaller floating foundation, and how that's going to be affected by maybe a lower wave height or wind speed, you know, compared to those big scale assets. So, but you know, I mean, there certainly are things that you can take, and you know, people are obviously putting a lot of focus on modeling all of these things and demos and all of those kinds of mitigants as well.
Yeah. Adam, I'm mindful that we've been talking a lot about offshore wind in particular, but how about solar or tidal? Are you seeing many of those projects?
Yeah, I mean, tidal, we've seen a few. At the moment, they seem to be more kind of proof of concept type or smaller scale. I think, you know, from looking at sort of the amount of things that have come across our desks, there seems to be perhaps not as much going on yet in that space. Yeah, and then solar, floating solar specifically, obviously, not floating solar, there is quite a bit of already. But yeah, I mean, you know, if you're talking about truly offshore, there hasn't been a huge amount. I think there's a big target for that in China, and I think the first 1 or 2 truly offshore floating solar farms are being planned or started around about now. So yeah, and you know, we have had solar on water, just inland, you know, lakes. Obviously there's, you know, less from you know, waves and all of that kind of stuff, the saline part as well, and so yeah, there are certainly lessons that can be learned from that stuff, but they'll need to be adapted for, you know, the truly offshore environment where we're going to see them.
And wind very much is where the action remains.
Yeah, I mean, I think so for now. I mean,
certainly offshore.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, floating solar, we'll see how that develops, and tidal as well. But I think, you know, looking at the developments that are out there, you know, the vast majority of the growth seems to be in offshore wind for now.
And picking up on newer technologies as well, Power to X and hydrogen seem to be in the press at the moment. I wondered if there's any more recent developments in those technologies that you can tell us about.
Yeah, I mean, those technologies have been spoken about a bit. I feel like, you know, in terms of actual developments, there's maybe a bit of a lag. Seems like we've been talking about them for a while now. Haven't seen too much in the way of actually kind of full scale. Yeah, I mean, also, the use, right? I mean, it's much easier for people to kind of, electricity obviously has far broader usage right now than hydrogen, right?
Assuming the grid connections are there.
Assuming they're there, which they're not always, but yeah, I mean, I think that those kinds of developments definitely are going to be important, but again, at scale, we haven't seen maybe as much come to fruition yet. So.
I think that's certainly what we're seeing from a kind of research perspective as well, is that lots of the discussions are about subsidies and tax credits that might be available for hydrogen in particular. And I think one of the most interesting developments, policy developments, has been in relation to what's known as additionality, which I think is very relevant to particularly green hydrogen, but then for offshore wind in particular, because particularly in the EU now, to gain hydrogen subsidy, you will need to demonstrate what's this additionality principle, and that is that you are adding to the grid, or that you're adding to the electricity generation. You are not taking that existing renewable power generation that would otherwise be used in the grid. You'll be taking that and using it for, say, the production of hydrogen. So it's really interesting that the focus seems to be on trying to push projects down the route of, if you're going to be producing hydrogen, you need to be creating your own wind farm or solar complex or whatever it might be. And that seems to also be helpful if there is a lack of grid connections. Because there's another factor I noticed in your report, Adam, or in the Allianz report, about just the number of years often it takes for projects to get grid connection availability.
Again, I think it varies, from one jurisdiction to another. I think, in the UK, we have kind of what doesn't look, to me at least, to be the most perfect system, because the transmission's built by the developer, has to be sold within 18 months, and you have all of these kind of individual developments, building their own transmission, which, if you live somewhere where there's a fair amount of offshore wind going in, it's probably not ideal to have, your back garden dug up every 5 minutes for another export cable, right? Say, for example. But also, in terms of timeline to bring the developments, to life, having to wait for permitting, or even just having to wait for a new topside to be built. Whereas, other countries, I'm thinking like Germany, say, for example, or, Belgium is another one where, they have more of a grid strategy offshore, which, then you're plugging multiple farms into that transmission. So you're not, well, first of all, you could say more efficient, right? Because you're only having to do that work once. Maybe you're building a larger scale substation or whatever, but you're looking forward based on what developments you have coming up, and you're not having to then have however many amounts of permitting, however long of construction, and all of that for individual grid connection.
There's a really good explanation of this in the Economist Technology Quarterly back in April 2023, where a number of these issues were discussed. And one of the key issues I saw, in particular in relation to the UK, was that you can apply for permits on a paper basis before there's any planning, and then applications are then considered on a first come, first served basis. So it means that often the applications are backed up over many, many years, some of which are in that queue where there's actually no plan yet to bring those projects to fruition. So it seems like a wider strategy is lacking in that perspective.
I mean, I think it's something that it's definitely up for review, I would say, or should be, right?
Yeah.
I think, there are certainly things that could be learned from looking at how other people do it, I would say.
Yeah. Adam, we've been talking a lot about the technology and, of course, of the size of some of the new wind turbines, and we often see some of the comparisons about turbine size in comparison with Big Ben or the Eiffel Tower. Have you been on any particularly memorable site visits?
Yeah, a couple, I would say. Yeah, I think visiting a large wind farm development in East Coast of the US and seeing they were about 1,200 ton, just the foundation for the tower, which that's some serious
Puts
scale.
into perspective.
Yeah, you do feel slightly nervous walking nearby or underneath them, but yeah, I mean, absolutely huge, right? And that's for obviously, the larger turbines. If the foundation is that size, it really does kind of open your eyes to tip height and how big the tower itself is going to be. So yeah, that and certainly seeing recently went to a floating demo as well off of the coast of Spain.
So you've seen them up close.
Seen it in the flesh, yeah, or in the metal, yeah, and yeah, I mean, cool to see something like that that we'd obviously been involved in for a while, actually in situ, and really interesting to see how that floater design performs. Certainly it looked like it was moving around a lot less than the boat we were on. That's
interesting.
Which was great to see. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid mine is less exciting, but on one very cold, wet and windy half-term day, we found ourselves looking for shelter on Brighton seafront and stumbled upon the Rampion Wind Farm Visitor Centre, which was exceptional. We got a chance to put our VR goggles on and travelled up walked or climbed up a turbine, stood on top of one of the turbines on the Rampion Wind Farm and looked out. The most interesting thing for me was to look at a real dissected cable. I remember talking to my daughters about this cable and saying, look at the different phases and look at the components and how important the cables are. And I really thought they were taking it in until one of my daughters just looked up at me and said, "Can I have a snack?" And that was that.
So, Adam, it's pretty clear from some of the things we've been talking about that renewables is going to be a very exciting place to go forward. So what would you say for anyone who's listening to this as an aspiring renewables underwriter? What are the key skills that they're going to need to have?
Yeah, I think, first off, having an inquiring mind, I think is really important. I think being able to embrace and understand new technologies and moving into new geographical areas, and also just really having that kind of desire to really help with enabling that transition that we're going through at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that you're part of that transition and part of that excitement that Biden spoke about in that quote that we had at the outset?
Yeah, I mean, I actually genuinely do feel like that. Yeah, because, insurance for these projects is so vital. Yeah. There's a lot of support from lenders a lot of the time. Yeah. There is, even putting that aside, it's a significant amount of investment. And, without insurance, I feel like, these projects wouldn't certainly be bankable as far as loans goes, but then also giving the project the security to be able to deliver what they need to in the event that something does go wrong. They've got partners in the insurance market that they can rely on to help them if they have a problem, and also the fact that it is a technology and a area of development that's so in that kind of discourse around climate and positivity and all of those things that kind of go along with that. I think that's really exciting. So.
Yeah. And there are any words of wisdom that someone maybe gave you at the start of your career that you can remember?
For me, I've been lucky enough to work with some very knowledgeable people over the years. Hopefully I've remembered some of what they did. So yeah, I mean, I think you can't always have the perfect risk. You'd spend your whole life waiting for that, I think. So it's being able to understand, what's imperfect about it and how you can make that work in a way that kind of, suits everybody as much as possible, I think. And I guess the other thing, that I always try to do is just be mindful of people, right? I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's everybody is trying to do the best they can, and it's just being understanding, empathetic, and trying to see things from as many perspectives as you can, right? To get to something that works.
So in terms of wrapping everything up that we've discussed today, quite clearly there are huge opportunities in relation to the very ambitious targets that are being set around the world for renewables, and particularly on the offshore side. And secondly, that is not to undermine many of the practical challenges that there quite clearly are that we've discussed. But what's reassuring to know, at least, is there are numerous insurance products out there to assist in terms of that growth as part of the energy transition. And the other thing that I think is really fascinating about the discussion we've had is there are, of course, many overlaps between oil and gas and traditional natural resources, insurance, but also in terms of how those projects are managed, how they're run, but also in terms of perhaps marine insurance as well. But then, having said all of that, renewables now seems to be its own very specialist area, of which that real specialist knowledge is required. So on that basis, thank you very much, Adam, for joining us and passing on that knowledge with us today. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you, Gary, also as well.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much for listening. It's been a real pleasure, and we hope to catch up with you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Risk Matters, the DWF Insurance podcast. We hope you join us again soon for future podcasts in our series.